Um, so yeah, so this is just like me running through some strange ideas that like I've been sitting on since I first heard about second brain back in September. Like the minute I heard the course title, I was just like, well, that's a fascinating concept, building a second brain. And I was a cultural anthropologist for my undergraduate degree. And so I've spent a lot of too much time in academia thinking about this stuff. So it's just sort of like, this is just like me exploring ideas that hopefully other people will find interesting. And like, these are like fun philosophical conversations to have around the idea of second braining. So I've called this How to Be a Neo-Cartesian Cyborg, but that's just like a funny title. And you'll see why in a minute. Okay, so I'm curious about the question, like why we believe building a second brain is like a good, valuable thing in the large scale, like goodness ideal. And what like historical and cultural paths brought us to believing that's a good thing that we should be doing. And whether this is all just like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, like Terminator cyborg fetish that we're running after. Um, so, I mean, one
Hmm.
question is why a second brain, right? Like, why not second stomachs or second hearts, or what is it that we're like making the brain like the organ that we clearly, unquestionably want to build a second version of? And like, what's wrong with our first brain? Um, like, why is it falling short? And like, who decided the criteria for what is the ideal brain that we're like building the second version of? So yeah, this is just like questions I'm asking as a digital anthropologist. That was like my specialty. That I wrote my thesis originally on the quantified self movement, which is like Fitbit trackers. It was back in like 2012, 2013 when that was first starting to come up, and it's like now it's like all evolved into whole different things. But I spent a lot of time thinking about like our minds and bodies and our relationship to digital objects. And like how that's shaped by certain economic and historical forces. There's like all these wonderful things to explore in that space. So that's kind of like where all these ideas are coming from. So there's a series of like historical concerns we should be like aware of, and I sometimes like call it how like Descartes ruined everything. So Rene Descartes was this French philosopher who was incredibly like intelligent and said all these incredible things, and really is like set the foundations of all of our Western philosophical theories, Enlightenment, the scientific rationalism movement, and he was the guy that said "cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. Essentially, he's just like a large figure in our cultural Western history. But he said some things that like have led to be problematic. So he first said the mind and the body are two separate things. That it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and I can't exist without it. So he very much thought that we could like do away with our bodies and just be like minds, and we would be completely fine. And like that was also the ideal we should shoot for as humans. And he also believed that emotion very much lived in the body and reason lived in the mind. And the core distinction between a human and an animal is that humans have reason in the mind and animals do not have minds. Like he very much was on the side of like animals do not think and they are just machines, and they don't have an inner internal life. Um, but to be fair, it was like 1640 and like he didn't have modern neuroscience, so like we can't like give him too much shit for it. um, and then he kind of expanded on. He wrote a good number of books and expanded this out into like these rather simplistic dualistic categories, which is like also a very like Western historical thing to do, is we like simple categories. So he kind of put on one side the mind, reason, humans, culture, rationalism is all these high ideals, and bodies, emotions, animals, and nature are kind of the second category. And we still live with these the way we talk about both of these. This shows up in a lot of modern day thinking and language. So it's like a very strong historical lineage that is still active and around. And the implicitness is the human reason culture animal is good and it's above, and body emotion nature animal is bad and it's down. And that most of human nature is like us trying to get the reason to control like the naturalistic animal. And yeah, we still talk about things in this dichotomy. It's slightly extreme and slightly reductive, and like has a few problems. Like now that we understand a lot more about neuroscience and how brains and minds and bodies work, we now understand that like bodies are very essential to how we reason in the world. So the way that we think is often in spatial relationships and embodied metaphors. So a really tangible example of this is we inherently think things that are physically up, so things that are above us, are good, right? Like the stock market going up, or like stock markets plunge, the S&P 500 rose, right? We talk about it in moralistic terms. So like this is like the Michelle Obama quote, when they go low, we go high. We clearly think that things that are morally better go up and things that are morally worse go down. We'll talk about being under the weather on cloud nine. And there's lots of examples of this. These are taken, if you want to like read more about it, the key like thinkers in this space were George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And they first in the 1980s wrote this book called Metaphors We Live By, and then expanded it into these other books like Philosophy in the Flesh. And they essentially established a whole discipline called cognitive linguistics that talks about how our embodied metaphors of the world help us reason and navigate how we think about everything. And it's like turned into a whole field, and there's a giant department at Berkeley for it now. So it became a very well-established modern theory that like is still used by most neuroscientists today. But it's really wonderful because it just gets you to finally like understand how much being bodies that move through the world physically determine how we reason about everything and how we think about everything through metaphor. So that quote, metaphors are shaped by the common nature of our bodies and the shared ways that we all function in the everyday world. And so we reason in terms of metaphors. So it's like we cannot reason without having a physical body. So in Descartes' dream of us just being a mind without a body, it's like we wouldn't have anything to think with. Another problem is that it turns out emotions are quite essential for reasoning. So if we really did just have emotions in our bodies that were completely unconnected to our heads in this like dualism category, we wouldn't be able to reason very well. They just have found now that people who have certain kinds of brain damage to the prefrontal cortex, they found that's mostly where emotional reasoning lies. And they can find someone who is completely functional, right, in all other intellectual aspects of their lives. They can pass an IQ test perfectly, like they seem functional, but they don't have as much emotional ability, and they make very irrational decisions, like they can't manage money, they get into relationships with like unfortunate people, their kind of lives fall apart, whereas before like having a brain tumor in a certain area, they would have been completely functional. And this is mostly taken from a book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, who's like a really interesting neuroscientist. He started writing this in the 1990s. He says, emotions are a way of guiding our own judgments and decisions. Emotions bring the body into the loop of reason. So his whole book goes into how if you don't have emotion, you don't have liking and disliking for things, and you aren't able to make rational, reasonable judgments about what you should and shouldn't do. So it really like it complicates the whole Cartesian thinking of like reason over here and emotion over here, because it turns out they're very intertwined, not just like neurologically, which they are, but in the way we use them every day. So it's like, okay, yeah, but like no one in 2020 like takes Cartesian serious, right? Like it's just like this historical legacy that we kind of like don't really buy into. But then you do kind of start to look around the culture, and I don't know if you guys know about the transhumanist movement. Oh gosh, sorry. Someone was just calling me, but I don't. Anyway. So I don't know if you guys have heard of the transhumanist movement. They have this idea of essentially they're a group of people who are trying to, it's actually very like Elon Musk Neuralink stuff, like upload our brains into the cloud, right? Like put me in Dropbox sort of thing. Where there's this idea that we're just going to be able to like map our synaptic structures to like some computational medium that's like a brain, and then there'll be an implant, and it's very like the Matrix. And like I don't know enough to know if this is really true or not, but it seems like there's going to be complications in how these like brains in a machine will think without human bodies to like reason with, or they will maybe just reason in a completely different way to the way we do now, because everything we reason about involves front, back, up, down, left, right, spatial, warmth. So if you don't have any of that, like you have to think in a completely different way, which if you like expand this to AI research, it just gets a little too weird. I'm not even researching that stuff. And so now if we come back to our like second brain idea, if we're really trying to build our second brain outside our body, what happens to embodied knowledge, right? Like you know, the way that we move about the world, it's like an active thing, right? Like encountering things, this is very like empirical knowledge based. It's how we watch and listen and feel in the world that determines how we know things. So there's all these things I can't put into my second brain, right? Like, I don't know if anyone else is a runner, but like the way that you run, there's certain techniques you can do it, or any kind of athletic ability. So the way you like put your weight forward and like run on your toes if you're a pose runner, like that's not a thing I know how to put into Rome. Like I can't, right? Or like you want to play like a song on the piano, like the muscle memory of how your fingers know exactly where to go and how to read the music, and none of that is a thing I can in whole put into my second brain. But they're all things I know, so they're information that I put into my brain, but it's also in my body, right? It's muscle memory, and it's like a thing I know through embodied doing. So this is maybe why Cartesianism like isn't that great. And then it gets into like our mediums limit what we then categorize as knowledge. So a lot of us, right, we're currently using systems that are text-based and require you to type lines from left to right in a linear line. And it's very hard to like draw a picture or like put music in or record audio or build any kind of spatial relationship. Or we can't record physical movement, right? If I want to show you how to do something physically, I might have to make a video. So there's these limits to what kind of knowledge we can put into our second brains. So yeah, so this is like if you're in Rome, there's all these rules you have to follow, right? Like don't go up, don't go back, don't go sideways, don't draw lines, don't pass go. Like it's very rigid in a lot of ways, which is mostly a limitation of our tools at the moment. But it determines what kind of knowledge we think we're saving. So then we have to ask, is it really right to call it a second brain if it's not doing most of what our real brain does, right? Because like 90% of our thought ends up being unconscious and automatic, and it's not necessarily under our control. So this isn't as snazzy, and I don't know if Diego really wants to call it this, but like it's more like some partial cybernetic extension of like some empirical collection system that does us like a very limited number of specific tasks that are mostly about writing and like maybe aren't that brain-like. So it gets us to ask the question is like, are our second brains a reflection of our real brain? Are we trying to duplicate them and upload them to the cloud? Or is this just like a small extension, right? Like a small extra tool, which is how I tend to think about it more. And then it leads you to think like, okay, well, maybe there's a better way to think about this or frame this, which I like the idea of cyborgs much more, where it's not like the machine replacing the human, but the melding of them in a way that adapts the machine to us and not us to the machine. So we're not trying to become more machine-like. We're trying to like change our tools and our machine to become more like us or to fit us better. And my favorite writer on this, he's like a philosopher anthropologist, is called Andy Clark. He wrote a book called Natural Born Cyborgs, which is like a really lovely poetic exploration of tools and our relationships to them. He has this thing of that what makes humans special is precisely their ability to enter deep, complex relationships with other non-biological constructs, props, and aids. It's like a very academic way of saying like it's beautiful that we like build relationships with physical tools outside ourselves. He has a lot. This is another quote from him. The more closely the smart world becomes tailored to an individual's specific needs, habits, and preferences, the harder it becomes to tell where the person stops and this tailor-made co-evolving smart world begins. And this is kind of important because how we think about the system determines how we use it and what we do with it and like how this all evolves. And considering how open and collaborative the second brain community is, like this is like what feels exciting as we get to sort of determine how this philosophy group kind of goes. So I think there's kind of two main ways to think about your second brain. And this first is to like upload me to Dropbox and like I don't want my physical body anymore and I'm just gonna like drink Soylent and like I don't exist as a physical being in the world. Like that's one version of it, this Cartesian ideal of just being the brain in the vat. I think that pushes us a lot more towards mechanical, linear thinking. We're much more likely to focus on like optimizing certain tools and like this very technical side of how do we make ourselves more machine. And then there's the other version, which is like this embodied, intertwined, reflective cyborg version, where we think much more about how we make the machines more human-like, and more embodied and less technical and more spatial and more movement-based. So I think of that as pushing us into second brain as a practice more than a tool. So it like prompts us to think more about how we use our second brain in terms of rituals and routines, like me getting up and going to my roam brain on the laptop and like what context is around it, like the desk and the time of day, and what I tend to do there and for how long. Like thinking through all that on a more meta level feels more interesting to me than like how to like make the roam like algorithm move faster. And that it's like leaning into this physical embodied material and treating that as a feature and not a bug of how we think in the world. So yeah, so that was like my anthropological reflections on like this whole second braining thing.